My name is Alexander, Alex for short. I'm 36 years old, a senior financial analyst at Morrison & Associates. And I've spent the last 14 years building a reputation as someone who is reliable, professional, and entirely predictable. Someone you could bank on. Someone who never made waves. I was checking my reflection, making sure my tie was perfectly symmetrical. My hair was in place, my expression was appropriately confident, but not cocky when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in an empty, executive washroom at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. A muffled sob, the fluorescent lights in the executive washroom hummed with that particular frequency that made my teeth ache. I'd just finished washing my hands after the quarterly earnings presentation, a presentation that had gone flawlessly, if I do say so myself. Numbers aligned, projections were solid, and I'd managed to impress everyone in that conference room, which was the whole point of everything I did. I froze, my hand still raised to my tie. Every instinct told me to leave, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, to walk back out into the hallway and continue with my perfectly scheduled day. Emotional displays made me uncomfortable. They were messy and unpredictable. And I didn't do messy, but something, call it curiosity, call it concern, call it some dormant part of me that hadn't been completely calcified by years of performance, made me hesitate. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone here?" The sound stopped abruptly. There was a moment of heavy silence. And then the stall door at the far end of the washroom swung open. The man who emerged was tall, with dark hair and the kind of face that probably looked beautiful when it wasn't streaked with tears. He was wearing a three-piece suit that likely cost more than my monthly car payment. And his eyes were the most striking shade of gray I'd ever seen, currently made even more striking by the fact that they were glistening with unshed tears. His name tag read, David Chen, Senior Architect. We'd crossed paths before. We were both members of the executive team, though we moved in different circles. I was in finance. He was in design. We didn't typically interact beyond the occasional nod in hallways or a simultaneous reach for coffee at the office cafe. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, turning toward the sink. His voice was rough, his movements jerky. "I didn't know anyone was in here. I needed a moment. I should have left." That would have been the kind, graceful thing to do, to pretend I hadn't seen him, to allow him whatever privacy this moment required. Instead, I found myself closing the washroom door. The click of the lock was loud in the sudden silence. "You don't have to do that," David said, not looking at me. "I'm fine. Just had something in my eye. Dust? Probably. The air conditioning in this building is terrible." I knew it wasn't dust. I'd been lying to myself and other people long enough to recognize a lie when I heard one. But I was also perceptive enough to understand that David was offering me an way to proceed that didn't require either of us to acknowledge what was really happening. I could take that out. I should take that out. "I'm Alex," I said, instead, walking over to stand a few feet away from him. Not too close. I'd learned long ago how to respect the boundaries of someone's pain. "We work on different floors, but I think we've seen each other around." "David," he said, as if I didn't already know. He was gripping the edge of the sink so hard his knuckles were white. "And I appreciate the concern, but really, I'm fine," I finished. "I know. You're fine. But you're also crying in the executive washroom on a Tuesday afternoon, which suggests that maybe something is not entirely fine." David's shoulders tensed. For a moment, I thought he was going to tell me to leave, to mind my own business, to respect his need for privacy. Then he made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. "I got a call," he said quietly, still not looking at me. "From my mother. She's in the hospital. She had a stroke this morning, and no one called me until now. No one thought it was important enough to interrupt my workday. I felt something shift in my chest, some deep, empathetic response that I'd learned to suppress over the years. But in that moment, faced with the raw reality of someone's pain, I couldn't suppress it. "I'm sorry," I said. That must be terrifying." "She's going to be okay," David said, his voice shaking. "The doctors think she's going to be okay. But she's in Providence, and I'm here." And he finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were so devastated that I had to look away. I needed a moment to fall apart before I have to go back in there and figure out how to leave without making everyone suspicious about my sudden departure. "Why would they be suspicious?" I asked carefully. "'Cause I've established myself as someone who doesn't do personal crises," David said bitterly. "Someone who is always professional, always available, always puts work first. If I suddenly leave because of a family emergency, it suggests that there are other things in my life besides this job, and I can't have people knowing that." I understood that impulse intimately. I'd spent 14 years building the exact same reputation, the exact same armor. "You should go," I said. "You should go to the airport right now and get on a plane to Providence. Your mother needs you." "I know," David said. "But I also know how this looks. I know that leaving right now in the middle of the quarter will send a message to the partners about my commitment to this firm. And in this industry, one message like that is enough to derail a career. Is your career more important than your mother?" I asked. David flinched as if I'd struck him. "Of course not." "Then go," I said simply. "I'll handle your exit. I'll tell Richard that you had a family emergency. I'll make sure your departure doesn't become office gossip. I've got enough political capital in this place that I can smooth this over for you." "Why would you do that?" David asked, and there was something almost suspicious in his tone, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone would offer help without expecting something in return. I asked myself the same question. Why was I doing this? I didn't know David. We'd never had a real conversation. I had no obligation to help him, but I was beginning to understand in that moment that I was tired. I was tired of performing, tired of maintaining distance, tired of treating every human interaction as a strategic calculation, and watching David struggle with the same instinct to hide, to pretend. To prioritize reputation over authenticity, realized that I couldn't bear to watch him make the same mistakes I'd been making. "Because we're more than just our jobs," I said quietly. "And I think you know that, even if you've convinced yourself otherwise." David stared at me for a long moment. Then his eyes filled with tears again, and this time he didn't try to stop them from falling. "Thank you," he whispered. Part 2. The cracks begin to show. I did exactly what I'd promised. I went back into the conference room, pulled Richard aside, and told him that David had a family emergency. Richard, being the decent human being he generally was, immediately released David from his obligations for the rest of the week and told him to focus on his family. David sent me a message that evening. "Thank you for everything. I won't forget this." I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure how to respond. The interaction in the washroom had disrupted something in me. Some carefully maintained balance that I'd managed to preserve for more than 3 decades. I went home to my apartment in the Upper East Side, a place that was meticulously decorated and entirely soulless. Everything matched. Nothing was out of place. It was exactly the kind of space that someone like me should live in, someone who valued control and order and the appearance of having everything figured out. But standing in my living room that evening, with the city glittering outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt profoundly aching alone. My phone buzzed. A message from my fiancée, Catherine, running late at the office. "Probably won't make dinner. Can you eat without me?" Catherine and I had been engaged for 2 years. We'd been dating for 6 years before that. She was a lawyer, smart and accomplished, and we looked perfect together in photographs. We attended the same social events, belonged to the same country clubs, and had the kind of relationship that everyone agreed was sensible. The problem was that I didn't love her. I'd never loved her. And I was increasingly certain that she didn't love me. Either that we were both performing in an elaborate play that everyone around us had agreed to watch without. Questioning, I looked at my reflection in the dark television screen and barely recognized the man. Looking back at me, David returned to work on Friday. He looked different, lighter somehow, as if the weight he'd been carrying had shifted slightly. He found me in the elevator that afternoon. "My mother's going to be fine," he said without preamble. "The stroke was mild. They're saying she should make a full recovery. I'm staying another week to help her transition to rehab, but I wanted to thank you in person before I left. For what you did, you would have figured it out," I said. "No," David said firmly. "I wouldn't have. I would have sat in that washroom until I'd composed myself enough to pretend that everything was fine. And then I would have gone home that night and checked my phone to find that my mother had been alone in a hospital all day. That's what I would have done, because that's who I've trained myself to be. But you reminded me that I have a choice, that I don't have to be that person."
The elevator doors slid open on my floor. I should have left, should have continued on with my afternoon. Instead, I found myself stepping back into the elevator. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "And I want you to be completely honest with me." "Of course," David said, looking slightly taken aback. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you're so focused on being the person you think you're supposed to be that you've completely lost track of who you actually are?" David was quiet for a long moment. The elevator descended past 3 floors, then 4. "Every single day," he said finally, "I wake up every morning and I think about what I need to accomplish, what I need to prove, what I need to demonstrate to make sure no one questions my place at this firm. And I realize that I haven't thought about what I want in so long that I'm not sure I remember how to want things anymore." "I'm engaged," I said abruptly. "Congratulations," David said carefully. "Don't congratulate me," I said. "I'm telling you because I'm engaged to someone I don't love. In a relationship that's essentially a mutual agreement to keep performing. And I'm realizing, standing in this elevator with you, that I can't do it anymore. I can't keep pretending." David looked at Mir, looked at Mir, looked at Mir. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I have no idea," I admitted. "I have absolutely no idea." Part 3. The truth beneath the surface. Ended my engagement with Catherine on a Sunday morning. In her apartment on the Upper West Side, I'd rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times. But the moment I started talking, all my carefully prepared words dissolved. "I'm not capable of being the kind of partner you deserve," I told her. "I've been dishonest with you about who I am, what I want, and what I'm capable of feeling. And you deserve someone who can be honest with you." To my surprise, Catherine didn't argue. Instead, she sat on her pristine white sofa and told me that she'd known. On some level, that something was fundamentally wrong with us. I think I always knew, she said, quietly. I think we both knew. We were just both too scared to say it out loud. I'm sorry, I said. Don't be sorry, Catherine replied. Be honest. Be whoever you actually are. That's the only thing you owe me. The next week was both exhilarating and terrifying. I'd removed the first major piece of the carefully constructed life I'd been maintaining, and everything felt precarious, as if the entire structure might collapse at any moment. On Wednesday evening, David texted me, back in the city. Would you want to get coffee? We met at a small cafe in Brooklyn Neutral Territory, away from the office and the world of performance that awaited us there. David ordered an Americano, black. I ordered something with too much sugar and milk, which made me smile at myself because it was exactly the kind of indulgent, impractical choice that the old me would never have made. So David said, stirring his coffee, You ended your engagement. How did you? I started. I work in design, David said. I observe details. You don't have your ring on anymore, and there's a particular expression on your face that suggests you've just done something terrifying and are waiting to see if the consequences are going to be manageable. Is that what my face looks like? I asked. Yes, David said. It's a good look on you, actually. Authenticity suits you. We talked for 3 hours. David told me about his architecture practice, about the buildings he wanted to design, about how he'd spent 20 years in a career that paid well but didn't fill him with passion. I told him about my life in finance, about the way I'd chosen the safest possible path at every turn, about how I'd become so good at performance that I'd forgotten what authenticity felt like. What do you actually want? David asked me as the sun was setting outside the cafe window, turning the street golden. I have no idea, I said honestly. For so long, I've only wanted what I was supposed to want: stability, success, the appearance of having everything figured out. But now that I'm not sure what I'm supposed to want, I'm realizing that I don't know how to want things anymore. Then maybe we can figure it out together, David said. The way he said it, carefully, gently, as if he was offering me something precious and wasn't entirely sure if I would accept, made me understand that he was saying something more than just, let's be friends. Are you asking me out? I asked. Is that okay? David replied. I should have asked first, I know. But I've been thinking about you since that day in the washroom, and I think there might be something there. Something real. But I also understand if it's more than okay, I interrupted. I've been thinking about you, too. I just have absolutely no experience with this, with being honest about wanting someone. Then we'll figure it out together, David said again. No performance, no pretending. Just to people trying to figure out who they actually are. Hash part 4. Learning to be real dating. David was nothing like I'd anticipated. There was no strategic maneuvering, no careful calculation of what to reveal and when. There was just ... honesty, constant, sometimes brutal honesty. We went to museums and talked about what we actually liked, not what we were supposed to like. We tried new restaurants and admitted when the food wasn't good. We walked through the city at night and talked about our fears. The fear that we'd wasted our 30s, performing instead of living. The fear that we wouldn't know how to be authentic even if we tried. The fear that the real versions of ourselves were fundamentally unlovable. My family doesn't know I'm gay, David told me one night as we lay in bed in his apartment in Brooklyn. It was small and warm, filled with sketches and half-finished designs and evidence of a life actually being lived. My parents know I'm single, but they think I'm just focused on my career. They have no idea that I've been terrified my entire life, that if they found out, they would stop loving me. Have you thought about telling them? I asked. I've been thinking about it constantly since I met you, David admitted. I've been thinking about how much energy it takes to maintain that lie, and whether it's actually protecting them or just protecting me from the possibility of their rejection. Would they reject you? I asked carefully. Don't know, David said. That's the most terrifying part. I don't know, and so I've decided to never find out. Which is, I'm beginning to realize its own kind of torture. I understood that torture intimately. I'd been inflicting it on myself for 36 years. We decided, together, to tell our families. It was both the most terrifying and most necessary decision we could have made. Part 5. The Reckoning. I told my parents on a Sunday afternoon in the living room of the house where I'd grown up. My mother was knitting something blue, a sweater, I think, though I wasn't entirely sure. My father was reading the newspaper, or at least pretending to read it. The scene was exactly as it had been 1,000 times before. Safe, familiar, utterly predictable. I'm gay, I said, and the words hung in the air like a physical thing. I'm gay, and I've known I was gay for a very long time. And I've been pretending not to be because I was afraid of what that would mean. I ended my engagement with Catherine because I realized I couldn't keep lying. And I've met someone, a man named David Ond. He makes me feel more seen and understood than I've ever felt in my life. And I wanted you to know that. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother set down her knitting. My father folded his newspaper. I'm sorry, I lied. I continued, filling the silence because the silence was becoming unbearable. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you the truth earlier. But I'm telling you now, are you happy? My mother asked suddenly. What? I said, thrown by the question. Are you happy? With David. Yes, I said. More happy than I've ever been. Then we're happy for you, my mother said simply. She looked at my father. And something passed between them, some wordless communication that they'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. He nodded. We're happy for you, my father repeated. Though I admit, this is surprising. I know, I said. And I'm sorry for the surprise. Don't apologize, my mother said firmly. Just tell us about him. Tell us about David. By the time I left my parents' house that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. They weren't perfect about it. My father asked some awkward questions. And my mother suggested a few times that maybe I should try dating women again to make sure, but they were trying. They were genuinely trying to understand and support me, which was all I could ask for. David's conversation with his parents was more complicated. His mother, when he told her, cried, but she cried because she said she was sorry that she'd made him feel like he couldn't tell her the truth earlier. His father was quiet for a long time, and then he asked to meet me. The three of us had dinner at a restaurant in Manhattan Neutral Territory, but also a place that was nice enough that David's father, who was a serious man with a stern expression, would feel respected. He asked me direct questions. What were my intentions? How long had I known I was gay? Did I understand that this would complicate David's career? Did I understand the responsibilities that came with being in a relationship with his son? I answered all of them honestly. I wasn't trying to impress him or convince him of anything. I was just being real. By the end of dinner, David's father was telling stories about David as a child, about the way David had always seen the world differently, about the way he'd always been more sensitive than the other kids, more observant. His mother was holding David's hand under the table, and there was a lightness in all of them that suggested something had shifted. I'm glad my son has you, David's father said as we were leaving the restaurant. He needs someone who sees him. I've always worried that he was hiding too much. Part 6. The deepening 6 months into our relationship, David and I decided to make a significant change. We quit our jobs. It wasn't impulsively, planned it carefully. But we also recognized that continuing to work in the corporate world meant continuing to perform, continuing to hide pieces of ourselves, continuing to prioritize security over authenticity. David left Morrison and Associates to start his own architecture firm, focused on sustainable, community-centered design. I left finance to pursue something I'd been passionate about since college, writing. I'd abandoned it 20 years ago in favor of more practical pursuits. But now I decided that practical had never gotten me anywhere close to happy. Are you terrified? David asked me the night before we officially resigned. Completely terrified, I admitted, but also more excited than I've ever been. I'm excited to see what happens when I actually try to live instead of just surviving. That's the spirit, David said, and he kissed me in a way that felt like a promise. Hash, hash. Part 7. Building something relay year and a half into our relationship. David took me to Washington Square Park. We sat on the edge of the fountain, watching the light fade from the sky, and I realized, not for the first time, but maybe more deeply than before, that I had become an entirely different person than the man who'd walked into that washroom 14 months ago. That man had been successful and hollow. This man was happy. "I want to ask you something," David said, and there was a nervousness in his voice that made my heart accelerate. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. "I'm not going to do the whole traditional thing where I get down on one knee, because that's not us. That's not how we do things. But I want to ask you, will you marry me? Will you keep building this life with me? The real life, the authentic life, the life where we're not performing for anyone, but just being exactly who we are." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. The ring was simple and elegant, a band of white gold with a small sapphire, because David had said it reminded him of my eyes. And I'd laughed because my eyes were brown, and he'd said yes. But there was something in them like the depth of a sapphire, like there were layers and layers of richness beneath the surface. Hash, hash. Part 8. The wedding. We got married on a rooftop in Brooklyn, with a view of the Manhattan skyline glittering in the distance. It was a small ceremony, about 40 people, all of whom were important to us, all of whom knew the real versions of ourselves. No performance, no pretending. My parents cried. David's parents cried. My mother made a speech about how proud she was of me for having the courage to be honest. And my father made a terrible joke that made everyone groan. But there was love underneath it. David's best friend, who was also gay and had been out since college, gave a toast about how brave it was to come out later in life, and how the courage it took to change your entire life in pursuit of authenticity was something to be celebrated. But the moment I remember most clearly was when David and I were exchanging vows. I looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had been red from tears when I first met him, and I said, "I promise to always see you. I promise to never hide from you. I promise to keep being brave, even when it's scary. Because the alternative is a life of performance, and I've already lived that life, and I never want to go back. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to be real. Thank you for being real with me." And David cried, and I cried, and everyone in the audience cried. And it was perfect, precisely because it was messy and emotional and completely authentic. Part 9. The New Life. 2 years after we met in that washroom, David and I bought a house. It was in Brooklyn, a beautiful brownstone with exposed brick and large windows that let in plenty of light. It was a work in progress, like we were not finished. Still figuring things out, still learning how to be ourselves. David's architecture firm had taken off. He was designing buildings that made people feel something, that brought communities together, that proved that business and beauty and social responsibility didn't have to be mutually exclusive. My writing had found an audience, too. I'd written essays about the experience of coming out later in life, about the cost of performance, about the liberation of authenticity. People read them and sent me messages saying they'd recognize themselves in my words, that they'd been inspired to have conversations they'd been avoiding, to make changes they'd been afraid to make one evening. I was working in the small office we'd set up in the house when David came in with wine and the particular expression that meant he had something important to say. "I want to tell you something," he said, sitting on the edge of my desk. "Something that I've been thinking about for a while." "Okay," I said, immediately bracing myself for bad news, because that was still my instinct to assume the worst, to prepare for disaster. "I'm glad I had a stroke in my family," David said. "I know that's a terrible thing to say. I'm glad my mother is okay, but I'm glad I had that crisis, because it made me reach out to you, and you helped me understand that I was allowed to prioritize my own life and my own truth. And that led to everything else, even the terrifying parts." I asked. "Especially the terrifying parts," David said, "because the terrifying parts meant that I was actually alive. I was actually doing something that mattered instead of just going through the motions." I pulled him down so that we were close, and I kissed him in a way that felt like gratitude and love, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly the person you're supposed to be with. Part 10. The epilogue. 5 years after that day in the washroom, David and I renewed our vows. Not because we needed to, our commitment had only deepened over those years, but because we wanted to. We wanted to mark the occasion of having survived the initial terror of change and come out the other side, not just intact, but thriving. We did it in the garden of our me. We did it in the garden of our me. We did it counted. The mark, the mark, the mark we wanted to mark, the cow in the tell-aid, the me. We are new, we are new, we new, we descend, we you bu on see you lie you to continue be you me brownstone. On a summer evening, when the light was golden and the air was warm, the same people who'd attended our wedding were there, plus some new people who'd entered our lives in the intervening years. Friends that David had made through his architecture firm, people that I'd met through my writing, colleagues and collaborators, and people who simply believed in us and wanted to celebrate with us. My mother stood and told everyone about the day I came out, and how she'd known in that moment that her son had found himself. David's father, who had become one of my favorite people, told everyone about the first time he'd met me, and how he could tell that David was loved. And when it came time for David and me to exchange renewed vows, I looked at him across the garden, with the Brooklyn brownstones in the background and the lights of Manhattan glittering in the distance. And I thought about the man I'd been 5 years ago. That man had been hollow and careful and afraid. That man had built his entire life on the foundation of performance. I promise to keep choosing truth, I said. Even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when I want to retreat back into the safety of performance. I promise to keep choosing you and to keep choosing myself, and to help you do the same. I promise to build a life with you that is real and messy and authentically ours. I promise the same, David said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise to never let either of us forget what it felt like to be hiding, so that we never take this for granted. I promise to see you every day for the rest of my life, and I promise to be seen by you. We kissed as the sun descended, and everyone cheered. And in that moment, I understood something that I should have understood a long time ago, that the greatest luxury in life is not security or success or the appearance of having everything figured out. The greatest luxury is being known, being seen, being loved for exactly who you are, without reservation or performance or apology. I had spent 36 years running from that. And then I found it in a man who was crying in a washroom. And it was the best decision I'd ever made. #, epilogue. 3 years later, on a Tuesday morning, just like the Tuesday morning when we'd met, I was sitting in my home office, working on a new essay, when David came in with coffee and the news that his new building had won an international architecture award. "I'm so proud of you," I said, kissing him. "This is incredible. We did it together," David said. "Not the building, obviously, that was me. But this life we built. We did that together. We went from hiding to living, from performing to being. That's the real achievement." Later that evening, we walked through the neighborhood where we'd bought our home, and I thought about how far we'd come. We passed the cafe where we'd had our first real conversation. We walked by the park where we'd gotten engaged. We returned to our brownstone, our home, the place where we'd built a life that was entirely ours. Do you ever miss it? David asked as we were settling into bed. The old life. The performance. Never, I said, immediately.